Alright, welcome everybody. Now, I have a few different videos that I should have already made, but I've been really busy with some other stuff going on in my life. So, in the next few videos, we're going to go over some of my philosophical essays. But first, in this video, we're going to talk about a history of surveillance, since we're all being watched by the deep state. And with peace and love, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe, like, comment, and share if you dare and care. I'd appreciate it. So, excuse me. This video is probably going to be titled The Eye of Power, because it is a philosophical history of surveillance. So, surveillance, which is from the French surveiller, to watch over, is often perceived as a simple, albeit invasive, act of observation. Yet its history reveals a far more complex phenomenon. It is a fundamental technology of power, a shifting architecture that has not only reflected, but actively constituted our notions of self, society, and the state. To trace the philosophical history of surveillance is to trace the evolution of the human subject itself. From a soul to be examined, to a body to be disciplined, to a data stream to be predicted. Essentially, in this video, we argue that surveillance has undergone a profound ontological shift. From a primarily theological and spectacular model focused on extracting confession and demonstrating servine power to a disciplinary model that produced compliant subjects through normalization, and finally to a control model that operates not through enclosure and correction, but through continuous modulation and the preemptive management of populations. Each epoch represents not merely a technological upgrade, but a fundamental reconceptualization of power, knowledge, and what it means to be a subject. Now I just want to dive into the origins of surveillance as a theological spectacle and servine gaze. So the earliest forms of surveillance were not bureaucratic, but theological. In the pre-modern world, the ultimate surveillant was God. The notion of an omniscient deity who witnessed all thoughts and deeds, recorded in the Liber Vitae, the Book of Life, established the foundational paradigm. To be seen was to be judged. Michel Foucault, in his seminal work Discipline and Punish, identified this as the spectacle of the scaffold, the archetypal form of servine power. The servine's power was made manifest not through quiet observation, but through its terrifying visible exercise. Punishment was a public ritual where the servine's gaze was inverted. The suffering body of the condemned became the spectacle, a theater of terror designed to reinscribe the absolute power of the monarch onto the bodies of its subjects. And now this system, however, was inefficient and prone to backfire. It targeted the body as a site for the display of power, but it did not seek to understand or reform the soul. A parallel form of surveillance emerged within the ecclesiastical practice of confession. Big words. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 mandated annual confession for all Christians, institutionalizing a technique of power that demanded individuals scrutinize their own interiority and verbally render it to a figure of authority. As Foucault later explored in the history of sexuality, confession was a ritual of discourse where the subject was constituted as and by the very act of confessing their truth. The priest's role was not merely to punish, but to listen, interpret, and guide. This pastoral power was a crucial precursor to modern surveillance. It was continuous, aimed at the soul, required the active participation of the subject, and produced a new kind of knowledge, intimate, detailed, and individualized. The seed of modern surveillance was not the watchtower, but the confessional. Its goal was not just to punish transgression, but to produce a self-aware, governable soul. Alright, on the disciplinary revolution, the panopticon, and the birth of the modern subject. So, the 17th and 18th centuries witnessed a seismic shift in the architecture of power. The rise of the nation-state, mercantilism, and the humanistic concerns of the Enlightenment created a new imperative, not just to punish but to manage. The spectacular, costly, and sporadic violence of the servine was replaced by a microphysics of power, a diffuse set of techniques for training, optimizing, and normalizing populations. This was the birth of what Foucault called the disciplinary society. At the heart of this new regime was the panopticon, Jeremy Bentham's late 18th century architectural blueprint for a prison. Its design was elegantly simple, a central tower surrounded by a ring of cells. From the tower, an unseen guard could observe every inmate, while the inmates, knowing they could be watched at any moment but never knowing when, internalized the gaze. The constant possibility of observation became a permanent self-policing mechanism. As Foucault famously argued, the panopticon was a machine for creating and sustaining a power relation independent of the person who exercises it. Its genius lay in its automatism. Power became visible but unverifiable, forcing the subject to become the principle of their own subjugation. Alright, so the panopticon was not merely a prison design. It was a social diagram. Its logic spread throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, infusing the architecture of schools, factories, hospitals, and barracks. Disciplinary surveillance was characterized by several key features. Hierarchical observation, a finely grained system of watching, from the teacher watching students to the headmaster watching teachers. Normalizing judgment, a micro-penalty for time, lateness, activity, and attention, and behavior insolence that created a grid of comparison. The goal wasn't simply to punish infractions, but to rank individuals against a norm, rewarding conformity and pathologizing deviation. The examination, a technique that combined hierarchical observation with normalizing judgment. For example, the medical exam, the school tests. The examination transformed each individual into a case, a describable, analyzable object of knowledge. It was a moment of visibility that simultaneously recorded and classified a subject, producing a new type of individual, the docile body, one that could be subjected, used, transformed, and improved. This era saw the rise of statistics, cartography, and demography, technologies that allowed the state to view populations not as a mob of subjects, but as a territory to be managed. Surveillance was now a productive force. It didn't just repress, it produced the modern individual, a self defined by a medical history, an educational record, a military file. The self became a dossier. So, another video I want to talk about, that is coming up on this channel, is going to be about the history of tribalism and how we've lost that as the states that we're in. We've lost tribalism. And it's funny that we're even called the United States because we're united in cancer. We're united in fucking diabetes and heart disease. That's how we're united. So, the network gaze, from disciplinary enclosures to the society of control. The latter half of the 20th century initiated a third transformation, one that philosophers like Gilles Deleuze argued signaled the crises in the disciplinary model. The enclosures of the 19th century, the school, the factory, the prison, began to dissolve. The factory gave way to the corporation and telecommuting. The school faced competition from continuous education and the internet. The prison system itself revealed its failure as a site of definitive correction. In his postscript on the societies of control, Deleuze argued that we have moved from a disciplinary society to a society of control. Disciplinary societies operated through confinement and periodic repetition. For example, you are no longer in school. Control societies operate through continuous, unfettered modulation, with the individual perpetually in debt or in training. Well, I'm going to fill my water bottle. Let's get some water. My gosh. Alright, so the surveillance apparatus of this new era is no longer the panopticon, but what might be called the synopticon, many watching the few, and more potently the omnopticon, all watching all. The shift is characterized by from a centralized gaze to distributed networks. The singular watchtower is replaced by a distributed network of sensors, algorithms, and data aggregation points. Surveillance is no longer a top-down structure but a lateral ambient condition. Every digital interaction, a purchase, a search query, a GPS ping, is a node in a vast web of capture. From disciplinary correction to preemptive modulation, the goal is no longer to reform a deviant subject but to predict and preempt risk. Algorithmic surveillance does not ask, who are you, in the sense of a stable identity. It asks, what will you do? It categorizes not by fixed traits but by fluid risk scores, credit scores, threat scores, employability scores. This is a shift from a carceral logic, punish the criminal, to a actuarial logic, manage the risky population. As Shoshana Zuboff argues in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, this has birthed a new economic order where the raw material is not labor or resources, but behavioral surplus, the prediction of human behavior. And of course, their use of AI, the government has their own form of AI that they're using to really use that to the max. From forced visibility to voluntary transparency. In a profound inversion, individuals now actively participate in their own surveillance. Social media, fitness trackers, and loyalty programs incentivize the voluntary surrender of intimate data in exchange for convenience, community, or status. The disciplinary subject internalizes the unseen gaze of the tower. The neoliberal subject performs their life for a network audience, turning themselves into a spectacle. This creates what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the Transparency Society, a space of positivity and exposure where negativity, secrecy, and the opacity of the self are eroded, leading to a new form of digital panopticism, one where we are not prisoners, but willing participants in a self-optimizing surveillance. Alright. In the philosophical consequences, ontology, power, and resistance. So this history reveals a trajectory of profound philosophical consequence. First, the ontology of the self has shifted. The pre-modern soul was constituted in relation to a divine witness. The modern self was a product of disciplinary dossiers, a stable entity defined by its place in a normalizing grid. The contemporary self, however, is becoming a individual, a term Deleuze borrows from his collaborator Felix Guattari, a constantly recomposed packet of data flows, whose identity is not a stable essence but a profile endlessly updated, sorted, and acted upon by algorithms. Second, the locus of power is transformed. So power is no longer primarily exercised by a sovereign or even by institutional hierarchies. It is increasingly delegated to automated systems. Algorithmic governance, or what some call algocracy, constitutes a new form of rule where decisions about credit, employment, freedom, bail, and health are made not by human judgment but by black box models. This creates a rule of no one, a Kafkaesque scenario where power is intensely present but without a clear locus of responsibility or appeal. Finally, the possibility of resistance is transformed. If resistance to sovereign power was revolt, and resistance to disciplinary power was the pursuit of transgression or counterculture, resistance in the age of control is more elusive. How does one resist being a data point? Philosophical responses are emerging. Some advocate for a right to opacity, as proposed by Edouard Glissant, a defense of the inexhaustible richness of the self that resists being flattened into a profile. Others turn to practices of encryption and anonymity, not as a retreat, but as a form of political speech. A reassertion of the private sphere against total transparency. The struggle today is not just over who watches whom, but over the very nature of the self that is being watched, and whether that self will be defined by its capacity for immeasurable, unpredictable, and opaque interiority, or by the algorithmic models that seek to capture it. And here's our conclusion here. Well, in my opinion, the history of surveillance is not a linear story of technological innovation, but a layered philosophical archaeology of power. It traces a path from the theological gaze that sought the soul, to the disciplinary gaze that shaped the body, to the algorithmic gaze that predicts and modulates behavior. Each stage has offered a different answer to the foundational questions of politics and philosophy. What is a subject? How is order maintained? What is truth? As we navigate the emergent world, biometric scanning, predictive policing, and ambient data capture, the lessons of this history are crucial. They reveal that surveillance is never neutral. It is an active force of subjectification. The critical task of our time is to decide whether we will allow ourselves to be constituted solely as data to be managed, or whether we can forge new forms of social life and selfhood that retain spaces for opacity, dissent, and the unpredictable freedom that has always been the hallmark of the human. The eye of power is watching. The question is whether it sees a soul, a body, or merely a data stream, and who, in the end, has the power to define what it sees. Thank you for watching this video with peace and love, and I will see you in the next one.